Let's talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. What is a necessary condition? If P is a necessary condition for Q, then Q can't be true unless P is also true. Or Q is true only if P is true. P is something that's needed, that's required for Q to be true. What about sufficient conditions? What is a sufficient condition? If P is a sufficient condition for Q, then P's being true is enough to make Q true. If P is true, then Q is true. So look at this example. Being a schnauzer is a sufficient condition for being a dog. So if something's a schnauzer, that's already enough. That's all it would take for that thing to also be a dog. Being a dog is a necessary condition for being a schnauzer. In order for something to be a schnauzer, it better be at least a dog. Notice there are ways in which necessary and sufficient conditions can combine and come apart. There might be conditions that are necessary but not sufficient. So being a dog is a necessary condition of being a schnauzer, but it's not enough. It's not a sufficient condition. There are other things that are required also in order for something to be a schnauzer. Being a dog is necessary, but it's not all that it takes. Think about another case of a condition that's necessary but not sufficient. Enrolling for a class is a necessary condition for passing that class, but it's not enough. You can enroll in a class and not pass it. What about conditions that are sufficient but not necessary? Well, being a schnauzer is a sufficient condition for being a dog, but it's not a necessary condition for being a dog. There are other ways of being a dog. Dalmatians are also dogs, but they're not schnauzers. So being a schnauzer is enough, but it's not necessary, it's not required. Or another sufficient but not necessary condition would be getting an A+ in a class. That's enough, that's sufficient to pass the class, but it's not necessary. There are other ways of passing the class, getting a B, getting a C. Then there are conditions that are necessary and sufficient. So, for example, getting every answer correct on a test is necessary and sufficient for getting a perfect score on that test. Now, it's important here to mention that in all these cases, there are some background assumptions. So specifically, you might say in the case of, getting every answer right on a test is a necessary and sufficient condition for getting a perfect score. Well, what if the teacher's just giving away perfect scores regardless of how many right answers you get? Or isn't it a necessary condition also that an asteroid doesn't hit the Earth? That's all true. These are background assumptions. Anytime that you evaluate necessary and sufficient conditions, there are surely some background assumptions that you're making. And that's just fine. So assuming some very basic background assumptions, then getting every answer right on a test is a necessary and sufficient condition for getting a perfect score on that test. What about conditions that are neither necessary nor sufficient? Well, being born in Oklahoma is neither necessary nor sufficient for getting into college. It's not required. There's lots of people who aren't Oklahoman who go to college. It's not required to go to college. And it's not enough. Just being born in Oklahoma isn't a guarantee that you'll get into college. Mixing up a bowl of ingredients for a cookie dough is neither necessary nor sufficient for eating a cookie. You could mix up the ingredients for cookie dough, and you could use that to make some cookies and then eat a cookie. But it's not necessary nor sufficient. First of all, it's not necessary. I could just go open a bag of Oreos that I bought from the store, and I'd be eating a cookie without having mixed up the bowl of ingredients. But it's also not sufficient. I could mix up the bowl of ingredients, but then never actually bake the cookies. Now that we've got some idea of what necessary and sufficient conditions are like, I want to talk about definitions. We can think of definitions as just a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, a set of conditions where each condition is necessary and all of them together are sufficient to define whatever the thing is that we're working on. So let's use an example. Let's talk about what makes something a triangle. So what's the definition of a triangle? We could, in order to define triangle, we could list all of the necessary conditions, all the conditions that are necessary to be a triangle, and then those together would be sufficient to make, if something met each and every one of those necessary conditions, that would be enough for that thing to also be a triangle. Okay, in philosophy, definitions are very typically written in this fashion. Something is a triangle if and only if. That if part is to say, hey, meeting everything that follows is enough. It's sufficient to be a triangle. The only if part is to signal, hey, all of the things that are about to be listed are necessary parts of being a triangle. Okay, well, one condition is that it's a plane figure, that it's a closed-sided figure that's on a two-dimensional plane. All right, so something's a triangle if and only if. One, it's a plane figure. Two, it has three straight sides. And three, it has three angles. So there you go. That would constitute a definition of a triangle. Notice how each of these conditions is necessary. If something is a plane figure but doesn't have three straight sides, well, then it's not a triangle. That having three straight sides is a necessary condition. Something has to meet that condition in order to be a triangle. If something didn't have three angles, okay, well, then it's not a triangle. All three of these are necessary for something being a triangle. And if something meets all three of these conditions, well, then that's sufficient. That's enough to guarantee that that thing is a triangle. Okay, I want to show you two more definitions. All right, and the idea is these are perhaps controversial. You might think, no, I'm not sure that's right. I'm doing this on purpose. So what about this one? The definition of a mammal. X is a mammal if and only if X is warm-blooded, X is a vertebrate, and X gives birth to live young. Now you might think generally, okay, well that sounds perhaps right, but somebody might object. They might say, wait, no, I'm not sure. Now why not? Well, because they might say, I can think of examples where there are things that are considered mammals, like echidnas and duck-billed platypus, where those things are considered mammals, and yet they don't meet one of the conditions. Namely, they don't meet the gives birth to live young condition. Both of these mammals actually lay eggs. Well, what that would mean is it's possible for something to be a mammal and yet not meet one of these conditions. And therefore, that condition must not be a necessary condition for being a mammal. I want to show you another one. For centuries, philosophers took this to be the basic definition of knowledge. We're using S to stand for some subject, some person, some being capable of knowing. S knows that P, that little P, is supposed to stand for a proposition, some sentence that could be true or false. S knows that P, if and only if, S believes P, S is justified in believing P, S has some good reason for believing P, and P is true. All right, for centuries, I'm saying, philosophers said, that's it. This is the definition of knowledge. We just have to work out the details of what counts as believing P, what counts as P being true, what counts as S as being justified in believing that P. And then along came this guy right here, Edmund Gettier, who objects, who says, well, I don't think this definition is right. Why is that? He gives some pretty wacky examples. I want to give you an example that's very much in line with the examples that he uses, but it's a little bit easier to follow, I think. Suppose you want to know what time it is, and so you look at a clock, and the clock says 12:15, and you now believe that it's 12:15. And not only do you believe that it's 12:15, you have a good reason for thinking that it's 12:15. You looked at a clock, and you typically take that as a good way, a reliable way to find out what time that it is. Okay? And suppose that at that very moment, in fact, it's 12:15. So what do we have here? If this is you or me, I have a belief that I'm justified in believing that it's 12:15. It's true that it's 12:15. I believe it. So I have a justified true belief that it's 12:15. But suppose I found out just a few minutes later that the clock was broken. So the clock, let's just say, was stopped at 12:15. Or the clock was slowing down because the batteries were wearing out, right? Whatever. It's a broken clock. Or it's like a display clock, right? I didn't even realize it's not even turned on. It's just one of those clocks that are like on the shelf as advertisement, and it just already had, a fake printout on it that said 12:15. Notice what that means. That means I have it really what, and say, just suppose the very moment that I happened to look at this clock, it really was 12:15. That means I still have a belief that it's 12:15. I was still justified in believing that it's 12:15. I tend to think looking at a clock is a good reason for believing that it's the time that the clock says. And it was true. It's actually true that it was 12:15 at the very moment that I believed that it was 12:15. Edmund Gettier says, well, there you go. It's possible to have a justified true belief and yet not have knowledge. It seems like in that case, I don't have knowledge. I didn't really know that it was 12:15. I just somehow lucked out, accidentally stumbled upon a justified true belief, but I didn't actually know it. I bring up these last two cases to show you ways in which definitions can be tested. If you are trying to figure out whether what you're looking at is a good definition, there's a couple of ways to try to test that. One is try to argue that one or more of the conditions aren't necessary. Try to come up with an example of the thing being defined where the example you have leaves out one of the conditions. And if you're right, if that really is an example, say, of a mammal, then you've shown that one of the conditions isn't necessary, and therefore that, as it is, isn't the definition of that thing. So this is what happened in the mammal case, right? The definition said, one of the conditions of the definition was gives birth to live young, and yet, hey, no, I can think of a case where something is a mammal and yet doesn't meet that condition, namely an echidna. That thing lays eggs. It doesn't give birth to live young, and yet it's a mammal. So that definition must not be right. It needs edited. It needs changed. It needs revised. But another way is to argue that the conditions are jointly insufficient. Even if something met all these conditions, that wouldn't necessarily make it that thing. This is what's going on in the knowledge case. Somebody can have a justified true belief, meet all three of those conditions, and just as Gettier argued, well, but that's still not enough. That's still not sufficient. Somebody could meet all that and still fail to have knowledge. Really quick, let me just say, there's nothing special about three conditions. I just happened to pick definitions with three conditions. Something's definition might require 2. It might require 20 conditions. There's no magic number that it has to meet. Okay, the other thing, though, is that I want you to think about is formulating definitions. So if it was up to you to actually have to concoct a definition, construct a definition, how do you go about doing that? Well, one way that you might start is to try to think of all of the cases, instances, examples of that thing, right? Try to think of all the mammals that you could possibly think of. Try to think of all the, instances in which people know things. And try to notice what they share in common. What do all of these cases of mammals I came up with, what do they have in common? And more importantly, not just what do they have in common, but what are the things they share in common with each other that they don't share in common with anything else, anything that's not a mammal. That's how you could do it. That's how you could formulate a definition. All right, that is enough for necessary and sufficient conditions.